There is a German writer who's often considered to be the first writer on terrorism. His name is Karl Hansen. And his work, his greatest piece is called Murder. He thinks, throw away the moral restraints. And he says, let's embrace the new technology of the bomb. And he says, we can create social change by chemistry. Okay. And we have to be in small clandestine groups because we can't fight in an open fight in any circumstance against the forces of order. That's disparity, and that's not there until 1848. And then from there on in, you'd see terrorism all the time. It'll change its cause, okay? But it remains surprisingly similar in its psychologie and in its methods. It will have its ups and downs. The anarchists will peak in France in the 1890s. In the United States, the third greatest terrorist attack ever in the United States happened in 1920. It was an anarchist bomb on Wall Street. Talk about that as being symbolic, on Wall Street. So it came at different times, but it was very similar. Another thing about terrorism from the outset, it was transnational. It was its own culture of resistance in which national borders mattered very little. It wasn't international because international is between nations. It was transnational. And terrorists read and learned from other terrorists and praised other terrorists. And you create a body of experience and a body of literature about terrorism. And it crosses borders. Absolutely. As a military historian, I have to deal with Clausewitz, whether I like him or not, because if you work with the military, I don't know how it is in France, but in the United States, you are given a copy of Clausewitz like in church you would have a Bible. And you will often quote from page something other. In our case, it's always the Perret and Howard translation of Clausewitz, that Clausewitz said this, so therefore it must be true. He was a 19th century soldier with an incredibly talented wife. There wouldn't be an on war without the work of his wife and her brother, okay, who saw war and explained war basically to deal with what Napoleon did in Europe. He had a late in the process enlightenment that I better talk about Frederick the Great too, after all I'm Prussian, okay? And so he's got limited war and total war, or various things you can call them. Delbruck called them war of annihilation and war of attrition, but okay. If you read him, he talks about will, yes, and sort of terrorism is about breaking the will. Okay, I'll give you that. But he never takes the morality of war seriously. He will say that there are these laws of nature, of nations and laws of war, which really don't matter much. And then he goes on. He uses the term moral, but what he really means is morale. L'esprit du peuple, l'esprit de l'armée. And it confuses some people. No. Morality is not what he's concerned with. He is concerned primarily with the physicality of force. Terrorism is concerned with the psychological reactions to force. Therefore, Clausewitz doesn't take us very far, because he's dealing with another age of war, and he's dealing with another kind of war, and he's dealing with the physical nature of war. Now, I will grant you, the physical leads to the question of will. I mean, after all, he certainly recognized that winning a war is breaking the enemy's will. It isn't killing every single person in the other person's army. But it's still the force that's the primary tool of all of that. And we know that in terrorism it isn't. So we have to say, we're in war, but we're in a different kind of war. And have to recognize it as such. I think that as I've studied terrorist groups and terrorist countries, I've been able to distinguish that there are four kind of patterns of what terrorists are doing. Intimidation is about fear. It's the oldest form of terrorism because it's about intimidation. You will obey. You will not resist. I will bury those 400 scholars so that everybody knows you better obey me. Fear is enough in that kind of terrorism. The most common, the one with the oldest lineage, intimidation is enough. But as soon as you get to terrorism, yes, there's fear, but people who just talk about fear and terrorism miss the point. They think if they just show they're not afraid, that's beating the terrorist. That is a very, very dangerous idea. Because how do you show you're not afraid of that guy? You're going to hit him back. The fact of the matter is, the terrorist is trying to get you to do what he wants you or she wants you to do. And the best way to do that is not to scare you, it's to make you mad. It's to make you react stupidly. As the United States did in 2003 going into Iraq, the worst foreign policy mistake the United States had ever made. And unfortunately, the world has to live with the consequences of that. Je m'excuse. I was against that damned war before it happened. There were many in the American military. One of my heroes, who was one of our major commanders, was Anthony Zinni. He opposed that war for all the right reasons, and the administration wouldn't listen. And Americans engage in a great and costly misconception that Saddam Hussein had been part of 9/11, which he never was. Well, we'll talk about that later. Okay. Fear is useful. Outrage is essential to terrorists. Because when you are outraged, you want to react, and when you want to react and it's full of fury, you're likely to do the wrong thing. And the wrong thing is using the kinds of violence that recruit more people and more resources for the terrorists. I trust you know about Bloody Sunday in Northern Ireland back in 1972, in January. It was a critical turning point in the war of the IRA against the British. In that, the troops in charge of trying to control a protest in Derry killed 13 people, shot down 13 entirely innocent people in the street. A 14th died later. Now, most historians will deal with that as those British troops got out of hand. Except it's kind of like they were helped, because the IRA, for at least 2 months before that happened, tried to create a kind of fury among the troops that were garrisoned in Derry. They attacked them with nail bombs. They shot them with snipers. This is all from accounts of people in the IRA, because they were trying to create a situation in which the British Army would go berserk against defenseless people. Now, they shouldn't have done it. That does not relieve the Army of their responsibility. And it doesn't relieve the government of the horrible decision to put the paratroops in there, because the paratroops are the most macho, most overreacting unit in the British Army, and they put them in crowd control. But the IRA tried to put them at a level where they would react, and they did. And the IRA weren't even on the streets when they started shooting the crowds, because there weren't enough IRA members for the IRA to be able to afford to lose people on the street. And the result of all of that was a huge increase in the number of people who joined the IRA to fight the British. So the acts of terrorism against the British Army created a situation in which the outrage of the British Army created a bunch of innocent victims who then, and in doing that, they became recruiting agents for the IRA. There's no question about that. There's no question at all. The outrage was much more valuable than fear because it got you what you wanted. Now, there's still debate on it as to what exactly bin Laden wanted America to do in 2001 and 9/11. And I have an opinion. I think it's a pretty good opinion, but I have an opinion, and I think he knew exactly what was going to happen. That the Americans would get into the war, and I can give you evidence of that. One of bin Laden's primary lieutenants, who was later killed in a drone strike, said months before 9/11, we need to get the Americans to fight in a war where they cannot win. That would be in one of three places: Somalia, Afghanistan, or Iraq. After the attack on the Cole, our ship in Yemen, in 2000, America sent a message through intermediaries to Mullah Omar, who was the leader of the Taliban. And the message was, you allow bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, to do something like that, and we're going to come into Afghanistan. So you get him out of Afghanistan. So Mullah Omar called in bin Laden to tell him he had to leave. And bin Laden convinced him that he should stay. But it was clearly on the table, if there was another big attack, the Americans were going to be coming, and not just with some cruise missiles. Now, there are some people today, some political commentators like Peter Bergen, who argue, oh, no, there was no expectation that the Americans go into Afghanistan. That's ridiculous. And you can demonstrate it from quoting his earlier books. I will admit something. I have a profound dislike for political pundits. Do you know what I mean? Pundits. It's an Indian term, really. It's about those who tell you that they know the way things are going to be. Okay, these are the kinds of people who advise governments. Okay, sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. But when they're wrong, they have to demonstrate that they were right. So they learn how to dance. Okay, and Peter Bergen's a pundit. And I know other pundits. And one thing that we as scholars can do is say, you know what, I was wrong. the worst thing you can do in your career is to not admit when you're wrong. It's bad for your character, and it can lead to even worse things. I'm not going to go off into that, but I could give you an awfully good example of it. And he's not French. Okay. So I think 9/11 was designed to get the United States to intervene in a conflict that they couldn't win, and then our government, led by very intelligent men. I don't know Rumsfeld and I don't know Cheney, but I have met Wolfowitz, who was one of the three. Forget about George Bush. He was a little kid down here. Okay. They were really smart guys. They were really sure of themselves. They had convinced themselves they had a way of warfare which was going to transform warfare by technology, and that they could use it in Iraq. And one of the consequences of them wanting to use their new way of warfare is they wanted a very small troop commitment. They wanted to show that they don't need 500,000 troops. They can do it with 125,000. To me, it was almost like the Spanish Civil War when the Germans wanted to try out their bombers and try out their tanks and that sort of thing. Okay. At any rate, and so they wanted that war for various reasons, and they then presented bin Laden, as it were, with the greatest present he ever received. We invaded Iraq. Those are all the results of outrage and terrorists getting into your head. Now, within that, so intimidation isn't everything. I think that you need to look at terrorists in many cases as that they're so weak, which is, of course, one of the advantages of terrorism, is you could enter into a state of violent conflict with only a few people and hope to have some result. They are so weak that they're really not going to be able to overthrow the government or achieve whatever goal they want on their own. But they all assume that there is this huge dissatisfaction for the red terrorists of the 1980s in Germany and Italy. They assumed, in a Marxist sense, there was this huge working class potential to overthrow the bourgeoisie. Boy, were they Marxist, okay? At any rate, for the anarchists, again, they thought there was a huge body of dissatisfaction, and while the anarchists are few, and they could really be few because anarchists didn't even like to form groups. So they didn't think that they were going to overthrow the status quo, and they also didn't think that they were going to lead this huge body of sentiment and people against it. All they had to do was get it in motion. Let me give you a metaphor, okay? Visual aids. Is there chalk around here? Aha, yes. Okay. We have a hill. And down here is an evil town, okay? Needs to be destroyed. Sodom and Gomorrah in one place, okay? And there's a huge boulder up here. And gravity will do the work. But it's stuck in place. It's embedded in a Christmas, so I'll do a Christmas tree. In a little, in a forest. The terrorists who believe in initiation believe and know They cannot move the boulder. They cannot destroy the crown. But they have a match, and they can burn the trees. And then everything will take care of itself. So people who are few in number with very little resource think they can change the world. And the terrorism of Narodnaya Volya, that killed, Tsar Alexander II, the terrorism of the Red Brigades in Italy, of the Red Army faction in Germany, of the Weather Underground in the United States. I laugh because two of the major leaders in the Weather Underground ended up as professors in universities in Illinois, both up in the Chicago area. And were friends of the president. Obama, not Bush. Okay. They were realistic enough to know they couldn't somehow do it themselves, but all they had to do, and one of the things that you have to understand about terrorism is terrorists live in small communities which are recruited and radicalized. And then they only hear from others what they're saying to others themselves. It's like an echo. And they begin to believe that echo represents the ideas and the beliefs of a greater world. And they overestimate, therefore, the kind of support they're going to get. They almost always end up thinking, well, these other people are just afraid to take the first step. And so we're going to help them take the first step. We're going to light the match and burn down the trees. Okay. The problem with groups based on initiation is they have great desires and tiny resources, and they usually fail. They usually fail. In fact, I can't give you a single group that is really dedicated only to the initiation that actually succeeded in its own terms. Okay? But it is such a common phenomenon in the history of terrorism. And as I say, it goes back to the Russian populists and French anarchists and all the way up to modern terrorists. You also see groups that are dedicated to attrition. Now, everybody talks about attrition, right? You wear somebody down, okay? They get tired. The IRA, in its 30-year history, actually the provisional IRA, okay, in its 30-year history of trying to overthrow the British, began with the notion that they were going to initiate. And in 1972, with Bloody Sunday, and then the negotiations with the British that failed, and then Bloody Friday. Bloody Friday was the IRA setting off about 20-some bombs at the same time in Belfast. It was the biggest action of the entire, the Irish call it the Troubles. It was the biggest action of the Troubles, was that summer, and it was in July of 1972. They thought they were that close to getting it all going. It failed. And by 74, 75, they start talking about the long war. The long war. And the long war will be, and I gave you a quote from the Green Book, we're going to kill and maim so many of them that they're going to give up. That is a recognition that they'll never be able to fight the British Army as a IRA army, that they are a terrorist group. But it's also recognition that initiation isn't going to get them where they're going. They're not going to win by this great rising that they'll precipitate. They're going to win by wearing down the British. There's always a certain amount of attrition involved in a terrorist campaign. But you can show terrorist campaigns where it becomes the dominant mode, and it'll work. I mean, the IRA did gain something. They wasted 30 years getting it, but they did get something. Evolution is what comes out of Mao Zedong for me. Mao Zedong said, you start with the political education, then once you've prepared, what he called the sea. He said the insurgents, the revolutionaries are fish. The population is the sea. The fish can hide in the sea, move in the sea, be fed in the sea. So you have to have the sea first. So you start with a preparation. Then you can go to what we would call guerrilla warfare or insurgency. Then you add some regular units to it, and you can have an interesting play between the guerrillas and the regular units. And eventually control enough territory, you can launch a regular army. For Mao, guerrillas don't win the Revolutionary War. The regular army does. He may have only had 5,000 or 6,000 people by the end of the Long March when he marched to the north of China in 1934-35. But in 1949, he had millions. Okay? We're observing a number of radical groups that began as terrorist groups and have evolved into states or evolved into armies or semi-states. I would say Hezbollah, Hamas, ISIS. But it's not always Muslim, because I would also say the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. The Tamil Tigers of Sri Lanka began absolutely as a small revolutionary body, destroyed all the other competition, and became a state. And might be a state to this very day, except that their leader overplayed his hand and the Tamil Tigers were destroyed. The interesting thing is once you evolve to a state, then in fact the meaning of terrorism goes back over to here. I would say that states that begin as terrorist groups learn to depend on terror tactics even when they become states. So some of the awful things that ISIS does are the kinds of things they did when they were a small group, but now continue even though they are a state, because they find them of value. Okay? I'm going to say one last thing, and then I hope somebody's going to ask a question here. Okay? Yeah. I did a book on war and culture. My book on Bayonets of the Republic really has a lot of cultural history on it, although long before we used the term cultural history. Terrorism has to occupy a space, as it were, well, let's see. It has to be bigger, okay? I'm writing cultural tolerance for violence. To be effective, You have to operate within the cultural tolerance of those who support you. But you have to go beyond the cultural tolerance for violence of those you're attacking. Because if you're going to create a sense of moral outrage, of moral shock, you've got to do something that's shocking to the other people. If it's too shocking, you'll lose your own supporters because they'll take you as animals. So you need to ask questions about the cultural tolerance for extreme violence. You need to be a cultural historian as well as a military historian. Okay, I'm going to sit down.